thank you for being with us today. I read your very interesting report about what states should be doing today to recover the economy and to have an impact on the economy, but also on the life that we live. So on ecosystem and etc. So can you tell us how this study actually worked?
Well, there's a wonderful journal in Oxford called the Oxford Review of Economic Policy that responds to live events, and we as a journal are producing an issue on COVID-19 and the economic consequences and impacts and so on. So that covers trade, labour, migration, fiscal policy, monetary policy, and of course climate change as well. So this paper was commissioned for that journal, and we started by thinking about the short, medium and long-term effects of the virus, the pandemic, on climate change. The short-term effects are fairly straightforward. Economic activity has collapsed because of the lockdowns, which reduces emissions of all sorts of pollutants, including CO2. But it's also had an impact on oil prices, which has had an impact on the deployment of renewable energy. The medium-term piece was the most interesting piece, and there, along with my doctoral student, Brian O'Callaghan, and colleagues from Cambridge, Dimitri Zengelis, the LSE, Nick Stern, and Columbia, Joseph Stiglitz, we spent the bulk of our time thinking about how governments were likely to respond. And we did this by having a look at the 700 different interventions either proposed or implemented since the financial crisis, but also surveying 230 odd economists in government bodies, treasuries or central banks, who are likely to be influential in the determination of the recovery policies, just as a way of getting a sense of what's likely to be coming. So that was quite interesting. I can say more about that in a moment. That's the medium term bit. And then in the longer term, there's an awful lot of change that we've all had to endure. We're doing this interview in ways that we probably may not have done a few years ago. And the question is, how much of that change lasts? How much of work remains remote? Do we all jump back into aeroplanes and cars after the lockdowns are lifted? And at a bigger level, what happens to international cooperation? What happens to the World Health Organization? What happens to the relationship between China and America and Europe? And what are the consequences for that on climate change and climate change diplomacy? So inevitably, that third part is a bit more difficult. So we conceived of the paper, and it's one of the most intense working periods I've had in the last few years. We had a great team of researchers working with us in Oxford to get it done, and we're delighted that we've managed to get it out there into the discussion so quickly. Okay, so what do you think will happen in the economy and in the environment due to this coronavirus period? Well, we've already seen over $7 trillion of state money going into the economy just to keep people alive, fed, with incomes, maintain jobs, and the solvency and liquidity of businesses. That's kind of phase one, this rescue type phase. The big question for me is what happens in the recovery phase, because we know that even with the rescue, we've got over 30 million unemployed in America, over 100 million unemployed in India, and large numbers of unemployed people across the world. So governments are going to need to create jobs at a very large scale in the coming year or two. And we also know that public debt levels are going to rise significantly as government spending takes place to try to restore economic activity. And so what we're looking at is what sort of policies are likely to have the kinds of features that you would want, economically speaking, over the next months and years. And you want policies that have a big economic multiplier. So for $1 of government money in, how many dollars do you get back in terms of the overall national income? You want policies that are relatively fast to act. There's no point investing now for a response in the economy 5 or 10 years later when we're back, hopefully, up and running again. And you want policies that, as you allude to, don't leave us in a mess, in some kind of different mess after the crisis. You want to think ahead to what sort of structural shifts in the economy are coming. And if we're going to bring forward multiple years of state investment, let's bring it forward in a way that prepares ourselves for the future. This is not just about climate change. It's also about preparing our labor forces for more automation, more robotics, more artificial intelligence. There are a bunch of these other big trends that we need to be ready for. But obviously, climate change is a big one of them. And for that reason, as we look through the range of different previous stimulus policies, there's a number of them that are relevant to climate change, and we included some of those in the survey that we ran with the officials.
Okay, so you're talking about 700 possible policies that states can run. Can you give us some examples of policies that states should not be running coming out from your study?
Well, one of the most interesting things to me, actually, was the least favored policy of all of the 25 types that we put to these government officials was an unconditional bailout of the aviation industry. The officials didn't like it in terms of its economic multiplier, its overall desirability, even its speed. They thought was a bit slow, which I'm not sure of myself. But and obviously, if it's unconditional, it's not so great for the climate either. So that's a policy that didn't seem to be a vote winner, or at least a favoured by the officials in charge. I mean, there.
What conditions are you thinking of when you say unconditional?
Right. Well, so I mean, there are various things that once you take public money at scale to save an industry, it's reasonable for the public to ask something in return. And in this case, the aviation industry is already a growing emitter of pollution and carbon dioxide for greenhouse gas and for global warming. And to date, the aviation industry has been, to be honest, pretty slow compared with other industries in working out how they're going to get themselves down to net zero emissions, which is required across the board. And I think if that industry is going to get a large amount of public money, it's entirely reasonable to say, with that money comes the expectation that you're going to reform, you're going to have a plan about how you're going to get to a clean aviation industry, and saying, as we are at the moment, that you'll basically continue as usual and you'll buy some offsets to cover any increase in emissions from now, which is the kind of default plan. It's not really good enough. So I think that'll be a reasonable condition to attach. And one way of ensuring that the condition has bite is to say that if you don't deliver on the milestones, then the debt can convert at some sort of set of terms which are reasonable but favourable to the taxpayer into an equity stake in the business.
So this is an example of what shouldn't be done. Are there some examples of what should be done and will have an impact on jobs, on return on what's being put in as money in, or even on environment?
Yeah, I mean, so there's quite a few good options here for governments. So there's a lot of retraining and reskilling that is going to be needed as the structure of the economy shifts. Now is a great time. If you're unemployed at any point in time, it's a good moment to go and reskill. So spending on training and education. Healthcare systems have taken a big blow. They're already probably short on money and worthy of investment. They come up as very desirable with quite big multipliers, because if you lift the health of your population, you lift its productivity. If you lift the skills and education of a labor force, you lift its productivity. So these are very good policies. Similarly, infrastructure that enables people to connect with one another in a low emissions, non-polluting way, like 5G, mobile networks, broadband, internet. Many countries don't have the full, the level of connectivity that they would ideally have. So it's a great time to do that. Likewise, there's an awful lot we can do with the natural environment. So we know that climate impacts are coming. We know that they'll look different in different countries. Where I'm sitting in Oxford, we have a flooding problem, for instance. And one way of addressing a flooding problem is to make sure that you've thought about the catchment and you've planted the right sort of species and trees and regenerated your ecosystems, so that nature itself can hold the amount of water that gets dumped onto the soil. This is very labor intensive. It doesn't involve high levels of skill. I mean, obviously the scientific thinking behind the catchment work does, but getting people out there and doing it doesn't. So it can absorb create lots of jobs, put to sensible use. And there's a whole set of categories like this: buildings, efficiency, more cycle lanes, provision of services for e-bikes. And the joke is a Keynesian stimulus back in the day was that you're better off paying people to dig a hole and then fill it in again, just to get money circulating through the economy. What we're saying is that if they're going to dig a hole, they might as well plant a tree in it and then fill it back in again. So you get something useful for the money that you're spending.